Dawn of War 4's developers have been answering more questions in the official Discord, and today we've learned some interesting new details about how the Necron economy works in team games, how their power matrices interact with other Necron players, and even how the game prevents multiple Necrons from becoming an economic nightmare. On top of that though, we also got a new detail about the Space Marines Eradicator Squad, including an upgrade that could turn them into an extremely powerful anti-vehicle unit. We've even also got some cool new screenshots that have been shared by the developers, which I'll leave in the B-roll background of this video, but also linked to in the video description. Anyways, let's start with the Necrons though, because this is probably the most interesting part of what was revealed. We already know that the Necrons' economy works quite differently from the other factions in Dawn of War 4. Rather than simply capturing resource points like the other factions, the Necrons expand their power matrix across the battlefield. This gradually brings them more territory under their control and generates more dominion, their resource, in the process. Now that immediately creates some interesting questions when you start thinking about team games, because what happens when you have two Necron players on the same team and both of them start expanding their power matrices across the map? Do they compete with each other for territory, or can those networks actually work together? Now, senior game designer Elliot the Beast has actually explained how that works, and allied Necron players essentially share one enormous power matrix. Now, when a member of the Discord actually asked about the power matrix and how two Necron enemies or allies would interact, well, Elliot explained that the enemy power matrices will block each other. So if two opposing Necron players are expanding their networks towards one another, they can't simply overlap their territory. Their power matrices effectively meet and block one another, which could potentially create another front that both players are fighting to expand. Allied Necron players work a little bit differently though, because Elliot said that the allied power matrices function essentially as a single matrix, providing resources and buffs to all allied Necron players. Now this could make double Necron team compositions particularly interesting, because instead of having two completely separate economic networks, well, both players are contributing towards this larger shared Necron territory. One player could potentially be expanding the matrix on one side of the map, while the teammate pushes it somewhere else, with both players benefiting from the territory that their team controls. Now there's obviously an interesting balance query here that immediately comes to mind. Well, if two Necron players can expand the same power matrix and both receive the benefits from it, could you simply stack Necrons on the same team and generate ridiculous amounts of dominion? The reason why this is important is because of course you have large areas of the map, but you only have certain numbers of control points, which is essentially how the other factions generate their resources. Now of course the developers have already thought about that. One person in the Discord suggested that dominion gained from each power matrix node could simply be reduced whenever there are multiple Necrons on the same team. Now Elliot's response was pretty straightforward, and he mentioned that this is exactly what they do. So the system appears to scale the economic benefit when multiple Necron players are present. You still get the advantage of having this combined power matrix covering the battlefield, but you aren't simply doubling the economy just by adding another Necron player. That sounds of course like a pretty sensible solution, because otherwise 2 or 3 Necron players working together could potentially snowball incredibly quickly. The shared matrix though still gives them that unique faction identity in team games, without creating an obvious incentive for everyone on the team to just simply pick Necrons purely for the economic advantage. Now of course there is still another side to this, because Dawn of War 4 also has to account for mixed faction teams. And so the obvious question is, well, what happens when you have a Necron player fighting alongside Space Marines, Orcs, or even the Adeptus Mechanicus? Someone in the Discord indeed asked that whether captured resource points still share resources with non-Necron teammates, and Elliot confirmed that they absolutely do. According to him, doing otherwise would create some very counterintuitive incentives in those matchups. He later expanded on this and said that the intention is for holding resource points to always be a net positive for the entire team, regardless of which factions are being played. Now that is of course an important piece of information, because you don't want to reach a situation where, for example, a Space Marine player doesn't want their Necron's teammate capturing something because it somehow damages their economy too much, or where another faction wants the Necrons to stay away from their part of the map because their power matrix interferes with their conventional resource generation. The developers clearly want capturing and controlling territory to remain beneficial for everyone. The exact calculations happening behind the scenes though might change depending on the factions involved, but from the player's perspective, taking more of the map for your team should always be something that you want to do. Now there was also a follow-up question about the possibility of double dipping. So for example, imagine a Space Marine player capturing all the conventional resource points, while their Necron teammate expands their power matrix across those same areas. Could the team essentially receive both sets of economic benefits simultaneously and end up generating far more resources than intended? Elliot couldn't actually remember the exact mechanics of this off the top of his head, but he did confirm that they have a solution for it already. And so while we don't know what exact calculation or modifier is being used, the developers are of course clearly accounting for these mixed faction economic interactions. I think this is of course one of those details that doesn't sound particularly exciting until you start thinking about how complicated Dawn of War 4's team games could become. Every faction has its own economic identity, but those systems still need to work together when you've potentially got completely different factions fighting on the same side. The Necrons are probably the clearest example of that because their economy is so heavily tied to controlling physical territory with the power matrix, whereas the other factions of course are heavily tied to controlling the power points and the resource nodes. The developers somehow have to preserve these mechanics whilst making sure that a Necron player isn't punished for having a non-Necron teammate, and at the same time making sure that stacking several Necrons players together doesn't become the obvious competitive strategy. And speaking of competitive strategy and perhaps some balance, we also got a smaller but potentially very important Space Marine reveal concerning the Eradicators. So the question was asked whether Eradicators could be equipped with heavy bolters or whether they are restricted to melter weapons. Now Elliot confirmed that they indeed have melters by default, but they can be upgraded to heavy melters. So this sounds like it could give Space Marines another extremely powerful option for dealing with heavily armored targets, particularly vehicles, but the upgrade isn't completely free of drawbacks either, because another player asked whether the heavy melters would come with some kind of movement penalty or deployment time. Elliot actually explained that the weapons are very powerful, but once the Eradicators equip heavy melters, they can no longer fire while moving. So with the heavy melters, you might have considerably more firepower against heavily armored targets, but you are actually going to have to stop and commit to the engagement before you can use it. This gives the opponent an opportunity to react, and also means that the Eradicators can't just simply chase down vehicles around the battlefield while continuously firing those upgraded weapons. Now this is a very nice touch, and I think is something very important for Dawn of War 4's unit design, where upgrades aren't clearly supposed to be just straightforward improvements in every situation. Changing a squad's equipment can alter what that unit is actually good at and how you need to use it, rather than simply just increasing a damage output number. So from this latest batch of developer answers, we've learnt quite a bit. Allied Necron power matrices effectively combine into one network, enemy Necrons matrices block each other, Dominion generation is adjusted when multiple Necron players are on the same team, and mixed faction teams are being designed so that capturing territory remains beneficial regardless of the factions involved. And then on the Space Marine side, Eradicators have been confirmed to have heavy melter weapons upgrades, giving them considerably more firepower, but at the cost of losing the ability to fire on the move. These are exactly the sorts of smaller mechanical details that I'm pretty excited to see being revealed, and it's very nice to see how much thought is actually being put into the team games mode. With that being said, which faction combinations are you most looking forward to playing with your teammates? Let me know in the comment section below. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up to date with everything Dawn of War 4. Take care and see you next time.